Alrighty guys, so hopefully you've noticed we're on to a new unit, okay? This unit is on learning. So here's some new vocabulary words, okay? Conditioning, guys, it just means learning, okay? Let's not complicate things. It just means learning. So conditioned means learned. Associative learning is learning that certain events occur together, alright? So there's two types that we're going to focus on, classical conditioning and operant conditioning, but today we're going to focus on classical conditioning. So this person in the next slide, here we go, is Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov was a Russian researcher investigating the digestive system. He did not set out to learn about learning. It was actually a mistake. When he made his discovery in the field of learning, he was studying the digestive system through saliva. He knew that by setting meat on a dog's tongue, they would salivate because salivation aids the digestive process. It allows food to slide down our throats and into our stomachs easier. However, he soon realized that dogs didn't always wait until they received the meat. It was actually meat powder, but the dogs weren't waiting until they actually saw the meat to start drooling or to salivate. Sometimes they would start to salivate when an assistant just entered the laboratory. Why? Because the dogs had learned from experience that these events, right, the assistants walking into the laboratory meant food was coming. So here's a picture of his dogs in his laboratory. So he started experimenting, right? And he isolated dogs in a small room and secured them in a harness and attached a device to measure the salivation, okay? So here's a picture of it. Didn't harm them at all. I know it looks kind of creepy, but it didn't harm them. And from the next room, they were presented food. First by sliding in a food bowl, later by blowing meat powder into the dogs' mouths at a precise moment. And then they paired various unconditioned stimuli, right, which is the food events. So they started pairing that unconditioned stimuli with something that the dog would never normally have a response to, right? Dogs are not going to just randomly start salivating when someone enters a room, or in this case, when a bell is rung. That's a learned behavior. So they started pairing the unconditioned stimuli, right, the food, with a conditioned stimuli like a bell to see if they could get the dogs to salivate. Okay? And they noticed that it did, right? So could they learn to salivate in response to any stimuli that signaled meat was coming? So what they did is the stimulus was a ringing of a bell. And he strapped the dogs into a harness to ring the bell. And he started to repeat this several times. And he even changed the procedure. He sounded the bell but did not follow the bell with meat, yet the dog salivated anyways. He had learned to salivate to the bell. So basically, right, this is the trial. If we ring a bell, give the dogs food, the dog will salivate. If we just ring the bell, eventually the dog will salivate even when there's no food. And that is learned, right? That's a learned behavior. A bell is never going to just randomly cause a dog to drool. Perfect. So that's classical conditioning. Learning where a conditioned stimulus, like a bell, is paired with an unconditioned stimulus, like meat, and it will elicit a conditioned response. So perfect. So again, an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that has the ability to produce a specific response before any learning or conditioning begins. So food causing salivation is a perfect example of this. So an unconditioned response or an unlearned response is any response that's produced by a natural stimulus. Perfect. But when we get to conditioned, this is something that's learned. So an initially neutral stimulus that comes to produce a new response because it's associated with the unconditioned stimulus. So for example, a bell being paired or associated with food is going to create a conditioned response, a learned response, in this case, salivation. So we have an example. This man, Aaron, and his Velveeta cheese story. So this is Aaron. When Aaron was 6, he loved Velveeta cheese. When everyone in his house was sleeping, Aaron snuck into the kitchen and began eating an entire block of Velveeta cheese. No one really knows what happened, but when his parents woke up, they found him on the kitchen floor, passed out, sleeping in his own vomit, and with the foils of cheese still in his grasp. Now, as an adult, Aaron cannot eat cheese. He feels wheezy at the very thought of cheese. So what's going to be the unconditioned stimulus in this story? Maybe a little bit of lactose intolerance, but also, right, the whole block of Velveeta cheese. That's the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response, right, wasn't learned. It was a natural thing for him to throw up when he ate that much cheese. But the conditioned stimulus is any cheese at all after that, okay? And that means that the conditioned response is him getting nauseous at just the thought of cheese. And this is actually called taste aversion, so learning to avoid foods because we've learned that we dislike them or that they've made us sick in the past. Perfect. So some other vocab words, extinction. So after conditioning has taken place, repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus like a bell with the unconditioned stimulus like meat will make the conditioned response weaker and eventually make it disappear. So if you just start ringing the bell and never present it with food, eventually the dog is not going to continue to salivate at the sound of a bell. It will go extinct. That conditioned response will go extinct. However, even if it goes extinct, reconditioning is relearning something that you've already learned, so it makes it a little bit easier. So relearning of a conditioned response after extinction, you only have to do it a few more times, right? A few more pairings, and you'll get that conditioned response once again. And then we have spontaneous recovery. So following extinction, if the the conditioned response reappears at reduced strengths if the conditioned stimulus is present again after a rest period. So if you give it some time and you stop ringing the bell but you continue feeding the dog, it will take a while, but and it'll be kind of reduced strength, but you will be able to still produce some sort of conditioned response even after a rest period. Okay, so for example, after the response of salivating at the sound of a bell has been extinguished in Pavlov's dog, a day or two passed during which the dogs did not hear the bell at all. After the rest period, the bell was rung. Even though salivation response had earlier been extinguished, it now was back. It was, however, a little weaker than it had been when it was in full force. Perfect. So, here we go. We have also stimulus generalization. So after a conditioned response has been trained to a conditioned stimulus, the same conditioned response will attempt to occur with similar stimuli without further training. The greater the similarity, the stronger the response will be. So basically, a woman decided to sort of copy Pavlov's experiment, and so she discovered that dogs would salivate in response to sound. So Pavlov obviously discovered that dogs would respond to sounds that were similar in bells. So then he tried to get dogs to salivate at the shape of a circle. Once they were conditioned, she would show the dog an oval, and she would see that dogs were still salivating. So the more closely the figure resembled a circle, the greater the strength of the response. And this is called stimulus generalization. Basically, you acting the same way to a stimulus that seems similar. Now, this can obviously create phobias. So a child attacked by a dog can easily develop a long-lasting fear of all dogs through the process of generalization. So a child attacked by one dog may be fearful of all dogs, which leads us to discrimination, which is acting differently to stimulus that are not similar. So if you were able to discriminate a circle from an oval, then you wouldn't be generalization, okay? You wouldn't be stimulus generalization. So a boy may have a phobia of all dogs, while he might be fearful of a stuffed animal because of discrimination. Perfect. So let's do a quick scenario. A boy named Bert was attacked by a dog when he was 3. Now Bert is older and fears all dogs. So the bite from being attacked is the unconditioned stimulus, right? You do not have to train a kid to be scared of a bite. So his response to that, his unconditioned response, was to be fearful or escaped. But what was a learned thing, right? A learned behavior. After he was bit, he learned to be scared at the sight of dogs. And because of that, his controlled response to a sight of dog was fear. And that's how you get phobias, which